She holds a BA in Italian Studies and master's research degrees in military history, Italian Studies, and history from Université Paul-Valéry, Montpellier. I'll just say it multiple times. Her research focuses on the socio-history of societies in war, the experience of Western European Jews in Nazi concentration and extermination camps, and the use of testimony and digital technologies in the social sciences, all of which we'll hear a little bit about today. Her dissertation considers the persecution of European Jews through the combination of quantitative and qualitative analyses of testimonies. She's presented her work at many different conferences, including a conference at the American University of Paris on the Visual History Archive and Research, the International Association for Genocide Scholars Conference in 2017 in Brisbane, Australia, and the Jews in Racialized Spaces Conference in Cape Town, South Africa in 2017. She previously served as the 2016-2017 European Holocaust Research Infrastructure Fellow, the ERI Fellow, and she is the PhD representative of the board of the Research Center of Crises, Experimental Research in Humanities and Social Sciences. She's fluent in French, Italian, Dutch, and English, all of which serve her research. Please join me in welcoming Bieke Van Camp.
Well, as you'll see, actually, I'm a bit less fluent in English, but we'll manage and go through all of it. So firstly, I would, of course, like to thank the Centro Advanced Genocide Research for the great opportunity this fellowship represented to me. And of course, special thanks go to all of those who have been there with great advice and great help also. So Marta, Isabella Badema, and Wolf, of course. So firstly, the work I will be presenting to you today is part of the chapter of my PhD dissertation that I'm writing right now. So this is therefore still an ongoing research, and this talk is a bit of a first test. All advice and comments to improve the chapter are therefore more than welcome during the Q&A. So I would like to have your input as well. So I would like to begin my presentation with two quotes to introduce my purpose. The first one is from Giuliana Fiorentino. She's a linguist from Milan and who was interned in Birkenau. So Olga has been my friend, my sister in the camp. At a certain point, we recognized ourselves as intellectuals, as two women that wanted to overcome this terrible thing. Overcome it with dignity, with intelligence, without losing our culture, conserving the memory of what it meant being two women, being two intellectual women. In the camp, this meant our salvation. So the second quote is from Giacomo Moscato's testimony. He is a street vendor and living in the area of the ancient ghetto of Rome. He was also interned in Birkenau. I talked to those I could talk to. I talked to those who spoke Italian, those who were Italian. I spoke a couple of times to that. There was a certain Jew who was a violin player. He talked, but I don't know anything about violence, really nothing. So there was no dialogue, not even there. So these two quotes stress, in my opinion, two related, important yet under-researched topics in genocide studies. On the one hand, the importance of bonds in the Nazi concentration and extermination camps in order to survive. On the other hand, the conditions that needed to be fulfilled for these bonds to exist. Important scholarship concerning the first topic I just mentioned has started to emerge, and I think in particular of Paris Papamichos Chronakis' research that he actually introduced here at the Shoah Foundation during the Digital Approaches to Genocide Studies conference. He argues indeed that, quote, historians still largely approach the camps as being composed of isolated individuals. This interpretive premise is sustained by the inherent linear organization of most audiovisual archives and the prominence of the individual survivor testimony as their organizing unit, unquote. In this sense, the study of social webs as a means of making sense of daily life in the camps needs further explorations. Other important research that operates social network mapping has mainly focused on the webs of 8 of those that went into hiding. but academic research has not, to this point, challenged our knowledge about social mingling in the camps. The survivors often being considered as a homogeneous group in the camps, in the aftermath of the war, scholarship hardly dealt with social classes of the survivors and how this factor might have influenced the camp's experiences. If it is well known that individuals coming from different national groups didn't necessarily mingle because of language barriers, can we also speak of social barriers? And when asking the question of how individuals survive, shouldn't we also add who did they survive with? The Italian Jews represent the case study that offers great research possibilities, partly also thanks to the research that has already been done. And I think in particular of the important inventory and dictionary by Liliana Picciotto that lists all individuals deported from Italy, but also of the large quantity of digital resources like transport lists and so on, which have been digitized and are available in the digital archive of the Centro, Documentazione, Ebraica, Contemporanea. On the other hand, the Italian case is particularly suited to network analysis. A very large majority of Italian Jews were deported initially to the same Nazi lager, to Birkenau, and they were deported during a rather small lapse of time. Deportation started in 1943, in October 1943, and ended in the end of 1944. The fact that the Italians were quite an eccentric group also, paired with their lack of linguistic knowledge, also enhanced the possibility of Italians sticking together, as a group or as groups. So first of all, I'm going to go through the sources and methods I mobilized in order to do this study, so that you have a sense also of how I actually did the social mapping. So first of all, it was necessary to determine the parent population of the corpus of witnesses I mobilized. I have thus targeted the Jews who were deported from Italy and who have testified on their concentration camp experience in the aftermath of the war, and preferably also at multiple occasions. In Italy, about 220 individuals met these criteria. Due to the large quantity of sources available, a central question to this research regarded the selection of the eyewitness accounts. The method of selection of the witnesses in the analyzed corpus are based on the model of the French socio-histoire, which is both a qualitative and a quantitative approach, and of course also on the practice of microhistory. A privileged tool in socio-histoire is biography and its inclusion in a prosopographic study. Therefore, the corpus built according to as many criteria as possible has to contain a wide variety of Jewish deportee profiles to get as close as possible to the criteria of a sampling model with good properties reflecting the different deportee realities of the chosen parent population. The age, social background, education, places of birth, data related to the deportation, different camps, different durations, and aspects also related to the testimonies themselves had therefore be taken into consideration. In this way, so by doing so, it becomes possible indeed to consider who speaks, when they speak, and from which background they speak, which I think is quite important doing work with testimonies. So the sources, the testimonies, are of course very extremely abundant and differ according to their nature, the time of their writing and or recording, which of course doesn't make them incompatible. Indeed, taking into account testimonies of a diverse nature, memoirs, oral testimonies, letters, diaries, and so on, induces different kinds of difficulties or limits, and their variety within the corpus is therefore important. So, if I mobilized in my doctoral research a wide range of testimonial sources, my Italian corpus held 70 witnesses for about 200 testimonies. For the purpose of social network analysis, I decided to fall back on a more restricted corpus of 28 oral testimonies included in the visual history archive. So from the 70 witnesses I had, only 28 were present in the VHA, and I all included them in this part of my research. So first of all, I'm going to describe to you the 28 individuals that I focused this study on today. So we have 16 men and 12 women. The oldest in January 43, when deportation started, is 29 years old, and the youngest 12 years old. Most are between 16 and 20 years old, so very young. A third of the witnesses were born in Lazio, especially in Rome. 4 were born in Lombardy, followed by the other Italian regions. It should be noted also that 1 was born and deported from Fiume, which is an area of present-day Croatia. 4 individuals were born abroad and settled later in Italy, often fleeing earlier racial persecutions in their home countries. So, most of all, Poland and Austria. The different social environments in which I have ranked individuals according to their symbolic capital, which goes to say their level of study and professions, are present rather equally, as you can see. So the reason why Rome is a bit overrepresented in this graph is also because of the fact that for the purpose of this study, I wanted to include every social class equally, and those deported from Rome very often come from working classes, and it was difficult to find them elsewhere. So that's why Rome is a bit overrepresented. So from the point of the concentration camp, from the point of view of the concentration camp experience, the 2 witnesses who were interred for the longest time in the camps were arrested during the roundup in Rome on the 16th of October 1943. The one who was arrested the latest was arrested in October 1944. Most of the individuals were deported through the Fossoli transit camp to Birkenau. In the camps, these individuals were selected for the most diverse forced labor commandos, as you can see over here. No, over here, I'm sorry. If those working in exterior forced labor commandos and factories account for half of the present sample, those who were in favored interior commandos account for 25%, and those who have occupied privileged functions and specialists count for about 20%. Finally, regarding their experiences as witnesses, without exceptions, all testified at several occasions in the post-war period, as you can see on this slide, actually a lot of occasions, or most of them. So for those who testified 2 or 3 times, these are all oral testimonies, which is also why working class individuals would have, anyway, 2 to 3 testimonies. But those are all oral testimonies. So the reason why I mobilized, for the purpose of my dissertation, testimonies of Shoah survivors as historical sources, is that solely the analysis of the latter makes it possible to reveal concrete social scenes and scenes of the camp's daily life. Analyzing a social space is indeed impossible without the words of the actors that compose it. As I said, for the purpose of social network analysis, I decided to fall back on a restricted subcorpus of oral testimonies included in the VHA, because when putting the focus on social links with other identified individuals, oral history collections reveal themselves to be a key source. And this is particularly true regarding the Italian interviews included in the VHA and in the CIDEC Interviste alla Storia project, where all of the interviewers in both projects insist on the interviewees quoting names of their co-deportees. In written testimonial accounts, the focus tends indeed to remain on the experience of the witness himself and on a couple of co-deportees, which are often quoted with pseudonyms, which makes it impossible for me to network analysis. And this, I think, might also be due, in part, to the more fugitive character of the spoken discourse. Something written remains, when published, becomes part of the public space. This often represents a barrier to the witness regarding the respect and protection of the privacy of the quoted individual and their families, of course. Also, as not to distort the results, I decided to rely solely on the testimonies included in the VHA and not on the testimonies included in the project I just quoted, Interviste alla Storia, because this would give me a fairly homogeneous corpus of testimonies to work with. Also, all the testimonies are recorded in the same year and so on, which also helps the homogeneous character of the sample. So basically what I was looking at when watching the testimonies were the names of witnesses quoted in their testimonies, as well as the bonds they tied with the latter and the situation they were in. So no matter what nature or importance they self-attributed to the bonds, I would take it into consideration. I would also add that I didn't use the VHA tags or the indexing words, as they were unfortunately incomplete as regards to the names that the individuals would quote. So in the first database, I would include, for every witness, the quoted individuals, the nature of the bonds, the situation of the bonds, and then all of the quotes, in order to be able to give some qualitative analysis as well behind the map of individuals. I do think that that's something very important as well. So the second step would then be the establishment of a list of all the quoted names and the research of their social environment and civil status. Mainly place, date of birth, and the sizes of their families were important to me. I prefer to emphasize right away that this data set is far from being perfect. Some quoted individuals have no names, but can be described socially or origin-wise. The witness would refer to the Polish man in the barracks, so there at least I had the origin of the witness, of the quoted individual, which was Poland, or the Milanese doctor, and there I had both, Milan and the fact that it was upper class, for instance. So others remain completely unknown. Another important limit of the same kind were the names quoted by the witnesses, deported from Rome and living in the area of the ancient ghetto. Indeed, in some cases, to apprehend their experiences and their frame of references, you actually have to be part of their world. So as the Ebraica lapse, literally the Jews from the square, to describe lower class individuals that are mostly street vendors, would say, quote, in the Roman ghetto, everyone knows everyone, unquote. Which is why nicknames are used for one another, always. Up to a point where most witnesses quote not even to know the real names of their mates. When the interviewers ask for precise names, they often recur to geographic descriptions. How well you know the son of the lady who holds the kiosk in front of the school, which of course didn't get me that much further. The same goes for the individual the witness only quotes the first names for. And it was important for me to know who these individuals were, also because if not, I couldn't see whether they appeared in other networks as well. So, however, by going through transport lists and databases that existed, I was able in the end to identify most of the quoted individuals in the testimonies and that were deported from Italy. Nevertheless, that didn't always make it possible to determine the social backgrounds of the quoted individuals, especially when they weren't deported from Italy. So finally, when taking testimonies as unique historical sources, however, brings in some limits as well. Indeed, a survivor who decides to testify in a certain, gives in a certain sense meaning through his testimony, to his experience, survival, and also to his life after the war. That's been also a key point through the 2 lectures we had in the past few weeks. In other words, some would quote lists and lists of names as they attribute their survival to the existence of solidarity in the camps. And others would hardly quote any names and emphasize on individual means of survival. This doesn't necessarily mean, however, that they didn't come across or bonded with other individuals, and this would especially be true concerning the weaker bonds. Also, more than 50 years have passed since the liberation of the camps at the moment of the testimony, which induces important biases on who to quote or even who to remember. In fact, the quoted individuals in general have or a bond of kinship with the witness, or are also survivors and are part of the witness's social network in the aftermath of the war. Here you see some photos of individuals that came together after the war. At the left you have the Romans that still would meet like very, very often and would talk about their experiences. They actually also testified together in a couple of occasions. And on the left you have an occasional television show where the women, the mixed Jews that went to Ravensbrück, they came together again. They actually were a strong group as well in the camps. So, and that's true also for another reason. So, some died in the camps but had a strong bond with the witness and members of his network before deportation and is therefore part of their collective memory. So that's also why some would quote more names and would remember more names. And then another reason would be that some died in the camp. But the members of their family have still bonds with the individuals. So someone would marry with a girl that whose brother has perished in the camps. Then of course the individual would remember that he came across the brother of the woman he married, for instance. And those were a couple of cases as well. So if none of the above, the individual is considered a key argument or a key resource to the survival of the witness and, quote, can't ever be forgotten, unquote. So, first of all, when analyzing the testimonies of the 28 witnesses I just mentioned, a total of 298 individuals can be listed, which roughly means that the number was multiplied by 10. So that means that every person quoted at least 10 individuals, more or less. So I'm going to present them briefly as well. So as I said, the deportees that were quoted are most of all survivors, or to a lesser extent, relatives. So in the stat that you see here on the screen, it might not look that way, as nearly 50% perished, but keeping in mind the proportions of survival amongst the Jews deported from Italy, which is actually 12%, the amount of survivors that were quoted results extremely high. The 16% of individuals that I couldn't determine the destiny for are most often those deported from countries other than Italy. This also goes to say that a very large majority, nearly 90%, of the quoted individuals was deported from Italy. So nationality right away appears to be a very important factor to the strengthening of social bonds among the individuals of the sampling. But that's also something that historiography already dealt with. So as regards to the regions of birth of the quoted individuals, some considerations should also be made. So from these stats, the region of Rome, Lazio, seems highly overrepresented again, but this time even more. But as you can see, the proportion between the quoted individuals and the witnesses is actually smaller than at least 4 other regions, which goes to say also that they would have bigger social networks, and I'll come back to that a bit later on. I'm giving a very quick overview over here, of course, but just to give you a sense of who we're talking about, but we can of course come back to these descriptions in the Q&A. So finally, a last data set had to be quantified, and that is that of the social bonds. So the bonds account for 312, and we can add also 224 bonds that were the bonds of kinship amongst the quoted individuals, but I didn't take them into consideration in the stats because that's not testimonies that I consulted. So as far as my sample goes, if the size of the networks are quite homogeneously divided amongst the individuals, these two stats show that those who had the biggest social networks, often also counting the largest number of strong bonds, are those coming from working classes, petty bourgeoisie, and those born in Rome, which overlaps, as you've seen earlier on, with the lower social upbringings. In this case, we can briefly note that all of those individuals coming from very large families, 5 to 10 brothers and sisters, are also in the same case of they all come from Rome as well. So here you can see the bonds according to the situation. So on the right, you can see all of the bonds that were strengthened in prison, in transit camps, or in the convoy. And that didn't last in the concentration and extermination camps, which of course goes very often beyond the choices of the deportees, and left the bonds the witnesses had in the concentration camps. So some of the bonds do go through all of the phases from prison to the concentration camps, and here they are calculated within the part of the concentration camps. That's a real limit to those stats, that you have one moment, and you can't describe the complexity of the bonds, or of the duration, for instance. So the third step, after analyzing the testimonies and processing the information, what we just did, is the actual social mapping. I did so by implementing the PageX software. So the latter is a program for the analysis and visualization of large networks. More importantly, the latest version of PageX is freely downloadable at its homepage. I put the link on the PowerPoint. Since I'm not necessarily operating large networks, I made this choice of program mostly due to the fact that the PageX files are essentially text files, net documents, where each line is an element the researcher can write by himself, which to me is always reassuring. First of all, regarding the concentration camp survivors, it is important to be aware that no classic social mapping and clustering can be done, as it is impossible to apprehend the network in its full complexity. Indeed, we can of course focus solely on the networks of the survivors that bore testimony. We can't interrogate the ones who perished in the camps, neither those who didn't testify. In this sense, my fear was here that in the end I would have a map filled with stars, with ego networks, one witness in the center, and he's on her bonds, and that's all. Still, I persisted, as the method seemed to me the only way to challenge the hypothesis of social mingling in the camps. Hence also the importance of a transparent choice of sampling and a widened qualitative analysis. I'm sorry about the baby. I established different categories of bonds. So pre-war I used mainly situational categories. You can see also on documents that you have on the chairs. So prison, convoy, and transit camps. During deportation in Auschwitz, I used categories like barrack-mates, workmates, encounter with a veteran, decisive encounters or important encounters, and then trivial encounters. And then, of course, the last one is kinship. The last category contains the bonds with individuals the witnesses met during death marches or in the camps they transited through before liberation. This unfortunately means that in the summary map, a bond between an individual has been linked to the witness in prison, as well as in Birkenau barrack, and in a work commando can only be tagged one way, as I said. I chose to privilege the bond in the Auschwitz camps and a barrack mate over a workmate. So most of those you will see as barrack bonds. Actually, we're also in the same work commando together, but I put only the barrack mate bond. So this is an important limitation, as one map translates a precise moment, and therefore can't offer a visualization of the complexity and duration of the bonds. A way around would be to multiply the maps at different time points, which I will do, but for today, since important scholarship already focuses on the duration of networks, I decided to focus on the vectors that brought individuals together. So let's go to the starting points and to the actual map of the 28 individuals. So I'm going to talk you through some of the generalities of the map, because like this it looks a bit messy, but we'll try to understand the map together. So first of all, my sample of 28 individuals is of course a very small sample. So what were the odds that there would be connections between two or more witnesses, especially since I didn't choose the sample based on interconnectivity, which is normally what researchers have been doing. As you can see, surprisingly, a lot of them are connected. Now, let's take a bit of a closer look. First of all, as you can see on the documents I gave you as well, I decided to put two sets of information on the foreground regarding the witnesses and the quoted individuals. Their birthplaces on the one hand, which differs according to the color of the vertices, and their social environments, which differs according to the shape of the vertices. Also, you'll see that the sizes of the vertices are different regarding whether I analyze the testimony or whether it's quoted individuals. As for the bonds, a dotted line means that the bond never went beyond Italy or the convoys, whereas a full line means that the bond existed during the time the individual spent in the Nazi camps. So we will be looking more at the full lines. The colors then represent the nature of the bonds. The most important one is the yellow one. It stands for barrack mate and occasionally also workmate. I hope you'll see them, because it's the more important one, but maybe it's not the clearest one on the screen. So I hope that will be fine. So as you can see, in prison, in transit camps, and in convoys, bonds of kinship form an important part of the map. Other individuals that are quoted are in most cases people the witnesses knew from before deportation. That can be explained logically because in those spaces, and especially in the Paul-Valéry transit camp, it was still possible to go around the camp and find and be with those who knew. In the cases of kinship, families were often arrested together through prison and remained together through prisons, transit camps, and convoys. However, when taking into consideration the bonds in the Nazi camps, kinship represents only 12% of the bonds, whereas barrack mates and workmates account together for 56%. So very few bonds of kinship. Something else also, in spite of what most witnesses would state, even though Auschwitz was a very densely populated place with important restrictions on movements, of course, still social bonds beyond barracks and work commandos were possible. The two cases that are most relevant to this study are on the one hand the bonds I qualified as important encounters, and on the other hand the veteran encounters, that together account for 14%, which is actually more important than kinship. When recollecting this information to the general map of the individuals, we can see that this concerns individuals that witnesses knew from before deportation. So this also goes to say that even in a space that has so many constraints weighing on it, some of the witnesses on this map still dared to reconnect with people they knew in spaces or moments they weren't allowed to. So I can, for instance, quote Romeo Salmoni, a street vendor deported from Rome. So you're asking whether I met someone, the interviewer asked, those from the square. Some of those from the square I have survived. I met Raimondo, I met Davide Di Veroli, which are both also in the VHA, so they survived. We met while I was a bricklayer, and there was the barbed wire, and oh, but that's Davide. I climbed on the ladder. Ada, Arome. We both started crying. He turned around and said, "Rome, look if the SS is there." Yes, but he's faced to the other side. He gave me some food. So this was a very important encounter for Romeo in his testimony. He then went on a lot about it. So the encounter with the veteran is very important as well, and often happens with someone witness knew from before. Giacomo Moscato, another Roman street vendor, remembers his encounter with Michele Amati, who was deported with the first convoy that left Italy. So I met with a certain Amati Michele. He would call him Roccioso, which I said, the nickname. He gave me a spoon, because in the beginning they didn't give us spoons. He said, "Watch out, do whatever they say, if not, they'll kill you," unquote. So these veteran encounters are more importantly a two-way street also. If the veteran helps the witness to understand some of the unwritten camp rules, the witness would give information about Italy and the situation of the family of the veteran. That's also why it's important that the veteran actually knows the deportee he's talking to. So every witness nearly quoted at least one veteran encounter. So those were quite important. So now I'm getting to what was one of my hypotheses, the geographical origin of the witnesses as a condition for the social bonds. So from this map, I think the clearest thing that emerges is the fact that the Romans mainly stayed with the Romans. It's the right part of the map. Here you have a focus on the Roman networks. So as you can see, except for Leone Fiorentino, who is in the upper right, all of them actually stayed the most possible with other Romans. All of them stayed with working class individuals or petty bourgeoisie individuals, so one up or one down. And in the case of Leone Fiorentino, he was deported at a whole other time. He didn't find any Romans in his convoy. He only found one, which was Renato Sonnino. And actually they stayed together all through the camps, and it was his strong bond, and the other ones weren't as strong as the one with Renato Sonnino, which unfortunately is not showing on the map. I'm just saying that, you know. And then for the rest, of course, they nearly all stayed with other Romans. So individuals deported from Italy, but coming from other nationalities, are on the one hand less isolated from individuals deported from other countries and Thai. Oh, the other countries are the black colors on the map. And Thai, on the other hand, most of their bonds with individuals deported from Italy, but they also born in other countries. That's what you can see especially with Agatha Hertzkovix, who is a lot with the Bieke family. The two youngest ones are born in Italy, but they came from other countries. And you can see the same, but it's not showing on the screen. On my PowerPoint, you can see it. The other links over here are all with strangers. So individuals deported from Budapest, mostly. You can say the same about Springer, for instance, who remains with Hedy Epstein. Hedy Epstein she also deported from Vienna. Well, she was born in Vienna and was deported from Italy, just like Elisa Springer. So also they would stay with the same kind of geographical origins. So that being said, though, the Jews that were born in the northern Italian cities do not necessarily remain with individuals coming from the same cities, but with those coming from other cities more or less close by. And it is here also that social backgrounds really come in. It is important to note indeed that where all individuals deported from Rome included in this map come from lower social upbringings, those deported from the other cities, the northern cities, come in these cases from higher social upbringings, and relate, as you see, to people coming from the same social environments but from other cities. On this map, indeed, the most important factor for social bonds to be strengthened is the social background of the individual, even more so than geographical provenance. Indeed, individuals coming from different social backgrounds nearly do not mingle, at least on this map, for this sample. The most they mingle is with one class up or one class down. So working classes would mingle with the petty bourgeoisie, middle classes with the petty bourgeoisie, but working classes and middle classes wouldn't mingle, at least on this map. The individuals coming from upper social backgrounds mingle with individuals coming from all over Italy at the conditions that they come from the same social background, to sum it up. So these observations are, of course, only some starting points to an analysis that has to be deepened, including also, and above all, the qualitative aspects of this research. So that's what I'm going to do as a last part of this public lecture. So first of all, I would like to consider the stronger bonds or the family units that are on the map. Something that isn't showing on the map, and of which I still need to improve the visualization, is the strength of the bonds. If a witness quotes 7 barrack mates, that doesn't necessarily mean that he has the same strength of bond with all of them. Some would be more occasional contacts or described as acquaintances, others would be defined as friends or even sisters or brothers, without there being a bond of kinship. Except for one individual, all quoted at least one strong friendship in the camps. Most working class individuals, on the other hand, all quoted at least 4 to 5 or 6 strong bonds. In both cases, this concerns little groups that divide everything they have, going from food, soap, spoons, sewing needles, everything you can imagine that they would have. A first factor that seems important to the strength of the relationship is the ratio. This can be, on the one hand, a relationship that already existed before the war, or a relationship that began in prison, in the transit camps, or in the convoy that went all the way through the different camps. So we can, for instance, quote Agatha Bauer, which the network you just saw on the screen. So she says, I was with my friends who had undergone the same procedures. Erna Berger, the 2 Kugler sisters, and Regina Berger. I turned 20 at Birkenau. These 2 sisters, Elena and Gisela Kugler, who knew that it was my birthday, wanted to give me a great and emotional surprise. And that's the moment where she starts crying in the interview. The oldest one, Gisela, had cut a thin part of her bread and others joined. They organized a bit of salt, and with the salt on the bread, she wrote, Happy Birthday. All of it had such a great meaning to me. So that was one of the moments. She actually cried only twice in testimony, so this was one of the more important moments in the testimony. So Agatha Bauer-Herskovits already knows both sisters from before the war, and the fact that they could stick together and celebrate a birthday is one of the experiences she qualifies as most significant to her survival. This is the most important within the Roman part of the corpus, of course. Alberto Mieri, for instance, states, I was always with my friends, because the fact of living on the streets, actually, of course they didn't live on the streets, but they were always outside. Most of them were street vendors, as I just said. They had actually had a lot of acquaintances already in the Roman ghetto. And they all quote to actually already know each other from before. So if the witnesses all insist on the importance of their group of arrival at Auschwitz, and therefore of the experience and therefore they insist on the experiences they have to go through together, which would establish bonds, it does not necessarily mean that those are tight links and that those will links that continue over time. So Liana Milul, she's a teacher and a journalist from Pisa, declares, in the barrack we remained united. All of our group from Fossoli, the 2 girls from Livorno, and Costanza the Roman. And then there was, coming from Fossoli, we all knew one another. In the quarantine block, we were all crowded together. So the 2 girls from Livorno are Selma Levi and her aunt Luisa Niños, a family of skilled workers. Both were arrested in Livorno, but came originally from Turkey. Costanza Strolova also has a working class background. Her father was a street vendor. Even though the last part of the quotation has already a negative value to it in Italian, hearing the first part it would seem that the group would try to stick together, or at least that the togetherness was in the beginning a comforting factor. Later on in the testimony, the witness states, I was always with Jeanette and Stella. Those are 2 girls from Paris. Oh, but in the room there were also the 2 girls from Livorno. Then the interviewer would interrupt and ask, oh, but didn't you have any joyful feelings when you saw them? The girls from Livorno? No, honestly, I didn't care. So in the rest of the testimony, she emphasizes actually her bond with the 2 French girls. So they were together in the quarantine. I didn't put them as barrack mates, Selma Levi and Luisa Niños, because of the fact that they were together only in the quarantine blocks and then later on in Teresian style. So, but you can see as well that those are very different social backgrounds, which was important to Liana Milul. So taking the words of Liana Milul and the map I've shown you as a starting point, I would argue that knowing and understanding the same language, understood both as a common frame of references, as social language, and in some cases the language we actually speak, is the decisive factor in the establishment of the friendship bond, the strong bond. In other words, it is the similarity that will bring people together. Also, by tying these bonds, it is not about searching for direct survival resources, but about the search of a little group, the individuals, the witness can feel and be familiar with. Hence, certainly also the difference in sizes of the strong networks. Those coming from large fraternities tend to have indeed more bonds than those coming from small fraternities, the strong ones. So we can see, for instance, this network, Liliana Segre and Luciana Sacerdote. So both of them said that they survived together. So the only strong bond on the map is actually the one between Liliana Segre and Luciana Sacerdote. As you can see, so we're not taking into consideration the dotted lines. They have very few other bonds. And Liliana Segre came from a family where she was only child. Luciana Sacerdote had only one sister, which is she's so showing on the map, but she died. So their whole survival relies on one strong bond and a very few weaker ones. This cannot be said for the Romans, as I already said. So all of those came from fraternities that went from 6 to 10 individuals. So, and they are quoting very, very strong bonds with nearly everyone. It's difficult to see which are the strong ones and which are the weaker ones, because they would speak a lot about the same bonds and so on. So in this sense, what the deportees focus the most on when relating to and with other individuals are the similarities in social upbringings, in education, in geographical spaces, in age, and even similarities in physical aspects. Elements that are, of course, all constructive parts of our social identity. As Ducci would say, I met a Czechoslovak, a chemist, with whom I spoke Hungarian. He was my alter ego. So both went to university, both had the same mother tongue, and both had the same age. We can also look, for instance, at the testimony of Elisa Springer, who describes her friendship with Hedi Epstein. I showed you the map earlier on. Deported from Italy, but born just like Elisa in Vienna. Both came to Italy, in Elisa's case, when persecutions had already started in her home country. Not only did they have in common their birthplace and their place of residency, because both chose Milan as a residency, but also some fundamental experiences like migrating. So we had truly become one with each other. If I said in the morning that I was really hungry, I received half of her ration. If she said so, I would give her half of mine. I was always with Hedi Epstein, also with some others, but always with Hedi, because we could exchange memories from Vienna. A similar bond can be found in Juliana Tedeschi's testimony, which I already quoted parts of in the beginning. So Olga has been my friend, my sister in the camps. Oh, that's not it. I'm sorry. We could talk to one another, remember a book, music, remember. She knew languages. Her mother tongue was French. She was born in Egypt. She was a woman I'll always remember. The exchange between us was our salvation. Especially being able to talk about a book, to speak, and being understood. These conversations with Olga happened when we returned to the camp. We could also tell a story, for instance. This would bring us outside the camp. That meant returning to being human for a moment. The friendship with Olga has been precious to both of us. The Olga in the quotation, in the quote, is Olga Ancona. She was born in Aleppo in Syria, not in Egypt, but that's a detail. And since Giuliana Fiorentino is a linguist, the fact that Olga speaks a certain number of languages, and that she comes from similar social upbringings, seems to be decisive for their bond. Upper-class individuals tend indeed to emphasize in general on poetics and literature as subjects of their conversations in the camps. You remember, of course, also the very famous chapter of Primo Levi's testimony, Il Canto di Ulisse, in which he decides to talk with John about the Divine Comedy, for instance. But these are things that recur in nearly all of the testimonies of upper-class individuals. So the quotes by lower background individuals are quite different to those quoted before. They would, for instance, emphasize on physical similarities. So I'll quote Fiorentino Deone. From Rome there was Renatino Surnino, with whom I divided a lot of months in prison. It is also true that we were both small and had the same age. We passed like brothers. Not that we said we were, but they thought we were brothers, and with absolutely no interest in telling the truth. Also, the fact that they were seen as brothers represented actually a way of staying together, because some other individuals would organize them to be able to stay together because of their kinship bond. The conversations would especially evolve around friends they had in common, especially for the Roman individuals, that didn't exist over there. Had in common, family topics and food. Since the witnesses are actually dividing all of their food together, that would create moments in which memories of food and typical dishes they ate at home would emerge. Again, I can quote Giacomo Moscato. We talked about the food that wasn't there. The dishes that Mama made at home that didn't exist over there. We talked about our childhood, about when we were little, about the nice things that we had. We spoke about ourselves. We always spoke about the nice things. There were no alternatives. We talked about mother, father, and so on. So what are the resources that these relationships can provide? Mainly, through these bonds, the individuals manage to maintain at least a part of their social identities. They remember who they are. Reorganizing in new family units and dividing everything you have is also a way to stay human. It is therefore the group itself that is a means of survival, and not the resources some bonds would provide. Also very important to note is that the witnesses, whenever they introduce their new family units to the interviewer, whether it concerns 1 or 2 persons or 3 to 5, the I in the testimony always becomes the we. So, and I'm going to finish with the weaker bonds. Other bonds would be qualified as important to the survival of the witnesses without there being question of important conversations, food divisions, or other forms of togetherness. The quoted individuals would in this case never be qualified as friends, but more like acquaintances. These relationships would be described in the testimonies when it comes directly to survival mechanisms. The networks of those coming from higher social environments present a higher number of those links as opposed to those coming from lower social backgrounds in the map. If in the case I discussed earlier, the relationships are never put on the same level as survival, here the relationships are evoked only to discuss survival strategies. So, Franco Schoenheid, who was interned with his father at Buchenwald at the moment of the testimony, states, "Luckily we had met a doctor, a Jew, who was the interpreter for the head of SS of the camp. 5 or 6 times he spoke into the ear of that SS, saying that we were father and son. We were always able to stay together. We owe that doctor our lives." So as you see also on the little map, so this was a case study of the mixed Jews, because they stayed a long time in the forcibly transit camps, so I wanted to see whether they mingled or not. That's not very important right now, but Franco Schoenheid is on the right, at the bottom, and you can see that in the camps he has only his father as a very important one, and then only one other bond, which is this doctor he's talking about, and that's the only thing. So the only bond he spoke about, except for the one with his father, was this one, because for him that was his reason of the survival. But they only spoke once. That's what he said. So I would also like to focus on the network of Arminio Waksberger, who was deported with the first Italian convoy on October the 18th in 43. So he would say, "I met a Polish Jew they called Fischer, the carpenter. He succeeded in getting the gold out of my teeth so that I could buy some food. I managed to gain forces thanks to that gold," for instance. As you can see also in the quote by Arminio Waksberger, who was a translator, it is not the social background or the similarities that are important here, but the resources the Fisher can provide. An important factor to access these relationships, it is also the case here, is language knowledge, especially in the case of the Italian survivors, which also partly explains why these bonds would be more present in the case of upper-class individuals. I would have loved to talk a bit more about the map, but I'm moving to conclusions also. So I have to say, though, that in the sample that I studied, a surprisingly small amount of the bonds can be classified into the category of weaker bonds. Indeed, most of all the quoted individuals had a strong bond with the witness, or they were quoted to honor their memory. Quote, "In my barrack there were also A, B, C, but they died," unquote. So to conclude, when studying bonds in the camps, this tool has several advantages, but it is, however, necessary to be aware of some of its limitations. Indeed, by endowing social network analysis with an explanatory value, the risk is to lose sight of the actors, the witnesses, the bonds, the situations behind the maps. In this sense, social mapping makes it possible to test hypotheses, but it is not sufficient in itself. Especially when using smaller samplings like mine, a qualitative approach alone can provide the context and the sense. What I tried to show today was the importance of similarity to create bonds, and how this familiarity or similarity was established between strangers that arrive in the camps, very often without knowing one another. For there to be a strong bond and a dialogue between individuals, there has to be social proximity. Also, the strength of the network built on language, geographical similarity, education, and social environment proves to be successful combination to the duration and solidity of the network. Most strong bonds continue indeed also post-war. I hope also it was clear that my purpose today was not to investigate on whether these bonds influence survival rates in general, as these witnesses of course survived, but others who had the same type of bonds might not have. So what I really was looking at is what factors condition these bonds. So what should be further investigated, and what I'm planning on further investigating on the one hand is the group functioning of the strong networks, and on the other hand the strengths of the relationships. I'm especially looking at how the group dynamics worked. Often successful groups, the individuals quote, have a precise organization. Every individual being assigned to a specific resource or a specific task. One would be working in Canada, another one would know or understand at least one of the important languages in the camps, another one would be more gutsy and dare to organize, and so on. When analyzing these group functionings, each individual contributes in a particular and proper way to the survival of the group. What I am also investigating, and what I've been doing here during these 3 weeks, is comparing these findings to the social network mapping of Dutch deportees. Their networks are much bigger than the Italian networks, and though they all emphasize on the importance of friendships, the establishment of bonds and networks in order to get direct survival resources, so weaker bonds, are way more put on the foreground. I'm still looking for more complete explanations, but I'm guessing that part of the explanation is the duration of their concentration camp experience, as they were interned from 42, whereas the Italians entered mostly in 44, and also the language proximity. Dutch Jew had a better understanding of German than Italian Jews. So now I would of course be very happy to have other suggestions from you all. So thank you.
Okay, so now we'll take some questions and have a discussion. Please feel free to pose your questions.
I have a technical question, but it's not. So did you had mentioned during the actual process of the testimony that interviewers might interrupt and then get information out of the survivor. Did you find that the rate of connections, of social connections, sped up as interviewers intervened? Did they help your maps become more
Yes.
full? And so basically, if one were to look at an interview where more interviewers talk, you might get more social connections.
That was the advantage of the research in the DHA. Because of the fact that interviewers really, it's not the case always, because with the Dutch sampling, I'm a little bit more worried that it won't get as where this has gone, because the Italian interviewers all had the same course they took, and they were actually asked to ask about these bonds in the camps and the individuals they met. So the Italian interviewers would actually interrupt quite a lot of times. Can you quote also names, and can you quote also those who were in the barracks with you, and so on, which of course made it easier for me to make those maps. So yeah, DHA was a great resource for this work.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a lot of questions, but maybe I start with two. One is, so since you use memory reports, right? Because they talk about what they kind of remember.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, you mentioned in passing, they don't talk so much about people who perished.
Mm-hmm.
So, but how do we know how important they were, and how this kind of importance changed over time in their kind of commemoration with others? You mentioned that they meet with other people, so when they remember together people who are alive, they maybe get stronger in their kind of memory. These bonds. So
Mm-hmm.
how can we kind of deal with this problem? And the other one was, I was struck, maybe you can elaborate a little bit. In the very beginning you had a table about classes, and I find this really interesting, these distinctions between working class relationships and upper class. But there was one table where you said, where you had that the functionaries were all upper class in your sample.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious about that. Is this coincidence because your sample is so small, Or is there something more to it, that they had more advantage, more access to kind of camp functions than others? And what does it say then about also how these functionaries are set in these networks? Because they are important for resources and so on.
Yeah, well, I'm going to start with the second question. So in my sample, that's completely true, but I think for the Italian part of the corpus, a great deal of the response is also the fact that those who were in the upper classes and who were in the camp functioning knew other languages, which is a real problem for those that are not that are in the camps, but they can't access other little jobs in the camps because they don't understand German or Polish or Yiddish and so on. So that I think that's an important part of the response. The response. Yeah. And the second part of the question, or the second question.
The other one was about the kind of temporality of bonds.
Yeah, but I
memory.
wanted to say something else about
The functionaries. So because their positions in the network because of their resources.
Yeah, okay. So especially I wrote it, but I didn't have the time to, well, for instance, Wagsberger, who was a translator and who had access to other jobs in the camps, he even translated for Mengele and so on, but then he helped also all of those who came with his convoy. He might not have had strong bonds with the individuals in his convoy, but he always was there to help, to translate, and so on. And that's something that you would see in other cases as well for this sample, of course. I'm only using what I found in this sample. Then for the question about the memory bonds and how to deal with that, well, that's a huge problem, and I'm not sure whether there is a response to that, whether we can deal with whether we can actually know how many bonds there would have been with perished persons and so on, because the sources that we have are these sources. I tried to do it with memoirs, diaries, and so on, but it would not get me much further. So if anyone has a suggestion, I'm willing to take it, but I'm not sure how to deal with it. I think it's important to say always during this type of research what the limits are of the sources, but I didn't find a way around it.
Speaking of limits, could you talk a little bit, you said the indexing of the names is incomplete or missing in some of these. So when survivors are sharing, when the interviewer is interjecting and the survivor is sharing the names, did you find that they were not indexed consistently? Or?
In some testimonies they were. Well, the interviewers would not really look at how the names would be spelled, so that would make very funny names every now and then. But in other interviews there were no indexing terms at all, so it depended really on from testimony to testimony. And then one thing was never showing, that was when a witness would talk about a doctor that helped them. If there was no name, then of course there wouldn't have been an indexing term. And even the indexing terms like social relationship or friends and so on were not always consistent through the testimonies I used. But it's also all the Italian testimonies, which are in Italian. I'm not sure how that works within the Schwab Foundation, whether it's the same indexing people or whether there are other people doing it. I'm not sure. Yeah. Well, it really changes from one interview to another. So I guess, yeah, that was a bit my problem with the text. But still, I think it is important to go through all of the testimony, also to determine the social background and so on. If you don't go through all of it, then it's difficult. And actually also for the quoted individuals, the interviewers, the witnesses themselves would give some clues to what the other individuals' background is, like the quotations I gave you. So that also would have helped me to do the databases and so on. So I needed the whole testimonies anyways. Yeah, I would.
Yeah, so I think you would like to go to a comparative analysis at some point.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you will deal with the fact that people from different nationality might mean very different things when they use the same word. So for Italians, friendship, it might be very different from what it means for Dutch people.
Yeah, I think the qualitative analysis would be very different, and that's very true what you're saying, because even the Roman part of the corpus, when they use like really strong dialect, it wouldn't be the same words as people coming from northern cities and so on. So that was already something not always so easy in what I did. Of course, when I'm translating them to English, we lose those things, which is also a limit, I think. But for the comparative part, I think I might be comparing more the sizes of the networks and the statistics, and the qualitative parts a bit less. I think I will keep them separately because also of the different cultural references, but also because of the fact that my Dutch samples, they weren't interned in the same barracks as the Italian ones. They had very different situations. I'm using a sample in the work camps and a sample in the medical experiments barracks, because that were places where they actually came together in big numbers for the Dutch part of the corpus, because the sample, the Dutch deportees didn't lend themselves as well as the Italian part of the corpus to social network analysis, because they were divided in so many different camps. And so I think lots of it I can't compare, but just the sizes of the networks and so on, that will be something I will be working on comparative-wise. Yeah?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you found or if anybody mentioned any romantic relationships or bonds, or if you would consider that a different kind of thing, or?
Well, actually, for the Dutch part of the corpus, there are loads and loads. There are women that would count about 5 or 6 or 7 of those bonds, but they are always put also on the level of the survival. So those men would help them to survive and so on. For the Italian part of the corpus, I didn't find not even one. Because if I would have put it on. I think also, because I compared the Dutch and the Italian part of the corpus also on those elements, I think that is also a bit of an Italian survivor who goes back to Italy is not the same as a Dutch survivor who goes back to the Netherlands. Dutch society was a bit more open, I think, than Italian society. So I still need to dive a bit more into that, but I have testimonies of Dutch survivors that would talk about an Italian survivor. I have the testimonies from, it wouldn't be the same versions at all. And in the Dutch part of the corpus, especially in the medical experiments barracks, which were in the middle of the Auschwitz men camp, these encounters were very important. In the Italian part of the corpus, I have nearly no quotations or no quotes or no fragments that would deal with those parts of the daily life in the camps.
It also be the culture. The
Yeah.
camps are known to
Yeah.
be very warm and friendly and easy to get along with one another, as opposed to, I don't know about the Dutch. I mean, I don't know, but I know about the Italians. I remember even interviews of survivors from Rhodes, which is
Yeah.
really a class. Yes, and one Italian soldier who was told to come to the home and take the father, the Jewish father, to take him away, and the mother just stopped, hid the father, and just talked to the soldier, give him a plate of spaghetti, which he could barely afford to give up, and he forgot to give the father. You know, I mean, what I'm trying to say, and the interview, he talks about that, that's how they are, they're friendly, and they're warm, so did that have something to do with it?
With the women encounters or with the social mapping?
Well,
I'm just going to take also this comment to say that the Jews that were deported from Rhodes, I actually found very similar things than the Roman map, because they also came, some of them came from working classes and so on, and they had a very close community as well. So I did find a bit of the same patterns as the Romans. Yeah, that might be a part of it, and I think especially within the parts of the corpus where the individuals had more, like, also when they are testifying, you can see the Roman ones where the networks were so big, they are very warm people, and they would really insist on the importance of being friendly and so on, whereas the other parts from the corpus a bit less. It's a bit in schemes, I guess, but that's what I found. I'm not sure whether I'm responding to the question.
So how do we explain that the Romans, when they are more working class, that they have bigger networks? Is this because, as you just said, they are more warm, or is it because working class always relies on bigger networks because the resources are scarce, so you need to kind of share in a way, so they are more used to this kind of thing? But then on the other hand, you could counter this and saying, upper class also depend on social capital and cultural capital, so they actually also rely on bigger networks. So kind of.
I think the biggest part of the response was the fraternities. I think those who came from bigger fraternities had more strong bonds in the camps also. So that was, I think, the biggest part of the response to that question. And then the real limit also to this work, which doesn't really allows me to give a complete response, is that all of my working class individuals came from Rome. So I'm not sure whether I can say the same things about working class individuals that would come from Venezia, for instance. So that's a real limit also to this work. So I'm speaking about the Romans, but as you said as well, we have the people that came from Rhodes. There are a lot of working class individuals and so on as well. But it was already a small sample, so I didn't want to include too many different. And then that's a real limit to what I did. So I'm not sure whether we can say it about the Romans. I would like to stay with the working class individuals. Yeah, one of.
Please, Martin.
Oh, you go.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. So you were talking about maybe doing overlays of the map to talk about the duration of the bonds. And I think one other thing where there's an opportunity to unpack it a little bit more are the places of the bonds and the ways in which bonds are strengthening or weakening depending on place, because it's such an impressive map. But it's sort of almost detached from any place.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had kind of overlays of like, this is the barracks, this is the work commando, this is the convoy, to show the ways in which bonds are changing. But then I was wondering, would that make it harder actually to measure or to represent strength of bonds? Because in some contexts or spaces, the strength of the bond might have been very strong in the convoy, but then in the barrack, it's very weak because the person's in a different barrack or is in a bed further away or something like that. So how do you think that adding place or space to your map would complicate what you're doing, or is it a dimension that you want to capture?
I think it is a dimension that I will capture, because in a presentation it's more difficult because it's limited in time.
Yeah.
So, but in the end I think it's difficult to understand the map when you see so many individuals and so many different kind of bonds. So I think what I am doing right now actually is multiplying the maps also. I made maps only with the individuals, with the bonds they had in Auschwitz, which is already more readable. And then I think I would like to do a map also where I have only two colors of bonds, the weaker ones and the stronger ones. I think that also needs to be done because I can say and so on, but you have to believe me, you can't see it when I'm speaking. So that's something I'm doing as well. So I think it is important to make more maps and to put them next to each other, and that way we can really see also the differences between the situations and so on, which is difficult to measure in a summary map or in a map that tries to grasp it all, I guess. So yeah, that is something I have to do. Yeah, Gabor.
Yeah, can you please elaborate a bit better how you came up with the social categorization, like what is working class, what is upper class, and how that can be inferred?
Well, actually, I used the work done by Christophe Charles, which is a socio-historian. So I used categories based on symbolic capital because of the fact that it's also testimonies. So I thought that was more important than economical values that the families would have. And I had a table with all of the professions, and then next to it there would be the social classes. So that way I was consistent in what I was doing. So I relied on the work that this Christophe Charles did to do the categories, but only based on symbolic capital, so on professions and studies, not on economic richness or those type of things.
So because like there were many Jewish women who didn't have any formal profession, not even formal education, but they were still member of middle class or even upper middle class.
Yeah,
so
that's
then,
a good point.
So then how do you?
Or many young children also that were
Whatever,
so
yeah.
I would use the category of the children that weren't 18 at the moment of their deportation. I would use the category of their father.
Okay.
The women who were deported, I would use or the category of their husbands, or the category of their fathers if they were children. If they were not working, if they were working themselves, then I would use their proper category. That was a good comment actually. Yeah, I didn't emphasize when I was saying.
In the beginning, you mentioned also briefly that family is not as strong as a category as you expected, as far as I understood. But there is also kind of a caveat because there was family separation and gender separation, and so this kind of directly influences a kind of family. And so I think the factor that this is so low is maybe also an effect of the policies in these camps, right? Including work, separation of barracks, and so it's much harder to stay together. And you can do a kind of be a mother and a daughter if they survive the selection, but it's much more difficult kind of husband and wife or mother and father and so on. And the other thing is, do you have some insights from the other end, if you think not from the individuals who are in the center of the network, but kind of the other people in spaces and how the question of place and space kind of influences the network. So for example, when an individual encounters different spaces, it's in a barrack, there's a certain work detail. How does this influence the creation or the size of the network? Because some are in work details which are very small, 5 people doing once, and this is for months. Others are in kind of like say work environments where they meet every day different people. So how does this influence the network?
So for the first comment on the kinship, yeah, that's completely why there are less bonds of kinship, but it's just that what, for instance, Paris chronicles did, the most important ones were the bonds of kinship. So that's why I was surprised to find so little. But it was I was relying on what other historians had done. For the other part, that's actually a very good remark that I really should look into. The only thing I can say for now is that I think it depended also a lot of on the fact of whether the convoys were very big, whether a lot of them entered the camps, and for instance, loads and loads of barrack mates that you have seen on some of the ego networks, if they would manage to stay in the same barrack and there was a big concentration of Italian Jews in that barrack, then that would influence also the sizes of the networks, of course. But that's the only thing that I can say for now. So I'm still looking into the rest, and I think therefore also multiplying the maps with the situations would help. That's the easier part on the Dutch corpus because of the fact that I'm just looking at particular places, like the medical experiments barrack or a work camp, which was smaller. So yeah, that's something I still, for the Italian ones, I still need to figure out. It's something that I didn't see in the beginning when I was starting, which is also why I didn't do it. It just came up afterwards when completing everything, and then I was, okay, now I have to dig into it again.
Can I adjust one point? It's also when you mentioned in the beginning that the time is when they arrive is important, and for a reason, for example, when you look at Auschwitz arrival and how selection processes work, you have sometimes weeks where nobody is selected because there is no need for labor. And then you have weeks where a lot of, or high percentages of males at least were selected. So I think maybe also this can kind of factor in how they stay together, how many stay together, and so on.
And which is a real limit to what I did for now, because I didn't take that into consideration when creating the sample, which is what I'm trying to do better with the Dutch part of the corpus. But it is a real limit, because that way some had big networks entering because they entered with 5 or 6 already, that were already a group. Others entered and all of their group was taken out by the selection, which is actually a real limit to this map for now. That's also why I took into consideration in the summary of the map the transit camps and the convoys and so on, to multiply the bonds and to see whether there was social mingling or not. Because only the bonds in the camps, some would only have 1 or 2. So that was a real limit also to, yeah, that's true.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bieke. Thank you all.